Welcome to a new episode of Inside the Economist's Mind. Today we're diving deep into a really fundamental concept, productivity. You hear about it buzzing in economic discussions all the time, but, what's the real story? We're going to unpack what it truly means, how it's measured in the real world, what sparks its growth, and why it's sort of the silent engine of our economic well-being.
Exactly. And think of this deep dive as your shortcut to understanding productivity. We've sifted through the details, the sources, to bring you the core insights. We'll focus on labor productivity, basically, how much each hour of work delivers, and also multifactor productivity, or MFP, which gives us a broader view of how efficiently we're using all our resources combined. Our goal really is to make this crucial concept crystal clear for you.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning, the basics. When economists talk productivity, it kind of boils down to this simple idea, right? What do you get out for what you put in?
That's it.
Our sources highlight that it's the amount of output we can, crank out with a specific amount of inputs. So if we're becoming more productive, we're either making more stuff with the same effort or maybe the same amount of stuff but with less effort. Simple enough, right?
That's the essence of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all about efficiency, maximizing what we achieve from the resources we actually have available, whether that's people, machines, or materials.
Now, one way we often hear about productivity is through this idea of labor productivity. What exactly does that tell us?
Right. So labor productivity, as our sources explain, is basically the output generated per worker, or more often per hour they put in. So it's a pretty direct measure of how much each unit of labor contributes to the overall production pie, so to speak.
Yeah. And the source gives us a couple of really clear examples, which helps. Like, imagine that doll factory turning out 120 dolls in, say, 40 hours of work.
Yeah.
That means their labor productivity is just 3 dolls per hour.
Simple division.
Or if a toy company generates a gross value added, we'll get to that later, I guess, of $5 million with 125,000 hours worked, their labor productivity clocks in at $40 per hour. So it's like a snapshot of how effective our workforce is being.
Precisely. And what's fascinating and what the sources point out is that lots of things can nudge labor productivity up or down. It's not just about how hard people are working. It's also about, their skills, the technology they're using,
Okay.
the way the whole operation is managed, and even the other tools and resources, the capital they have at their disposal.
Right. So if that doll factory upgrades to some fancy new sewing machines, suddenly those same workers might stitch together way more dolls in the same amount of time. Bingo, higher labor productivity.
Exactly. Better tools make people more productive.
Okay. Now, our sources also talk about multi-factor productivity, MFP. This sounds like it takes a wider view than just looking at labor.
It does. Yeah, multifactor productivity, or MFP as it's often called, looks at the output we get for every unit of combined inputs. And when we say combined inputs, we're usually talking about both labor and capital, so the workforce plus all the machinery, buildings, software, that kind of thing. But sometimes it can also include other factors like energy, materials, services used.
Okay, so while labor productivity zooms in on worker efficiency, MFP is more about the efficiency of the entire production engine, the whole setup.
Exactly. And the really key insight with MFP, the thing to grasp, is that it captures the changes in output that aren't just down to having more inputs, like more workers or more machines. It's often seen as a reflection of how well we're combining everything. And that often points towards things like new technologies, better ways of organizing work, innovation, basically.
Okay. The source mentions that MFP is often tracked using growth rates based on indexes. Now, that sounds a bit abstract, maybe, like comparing apples and oranges over time. How does that work?
Well, think of an index as just setting a starting point. Let's say we set both output and our combined inputs to 100 in year one.
Okay, a baseline.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then in year two, maybe our output index jumps to 107, so output grew 7%. And maybe our combined inputs index went up to 105, inputs grew 5%.
Right.
Then our MFP index would be roughly 107 divided by 105, which is about 1.9 per 9. So that tells us our MFP, our overall efficiency, has grown by 1.9% between those 2 years. It's about seeing if our output engine is getting more powerful relative to the fuel, the inputs we're putting in, even if both are increasing.
Got it. So it's a way to see if we're squeezing more value out of our total effort over time, not just by, throwing more people or machines at the problem.
Precisely. It's about working smarter, not just harder or with more stuff.
Now, how does the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the ABS, actually go about measuring this complex stuff for the whole country? It sounds like a huge task.
It is a huge task. And the ABS is the key player here, as our source points out. They calculate productivity by basically dividing their measure of total output by their measure of total inputs. It sounds simple, but measuring those two things is complex. For measuring the output of different industries and sectors, they typically use something called gross value added, or GVA.
Oh yeah, GVA. Let's unpack that a bit.
Sure. Imagine the total value of everything in industry produces all the goods and services.
Hmm.
GVA is that total value minus the cost of all the raw materials and other intermediate things they used up in the process, like electricity, components, etc. So it's the value they actually added to the economy through their own activities.
I see. The value add.
Exactly. And if you add up the GVA from all the different industries, and then you adjust for taxes and subsidies on products, you basically arrive at the gross domestic product, or GDP.
Right. GDP, the big headline number we always hear about. Okay. So that's the output side covered, using GVA mainly. What about measuring the inputs?
Good question. The source tells us the two main inputs they focus on are labor and capital. Now, for labor input, they could just count the number of people employed. But they prefer to use the total number of hours worked across the economy or industry.
Why hours?
Well, it gives a more precise picture. It accounts for part-time work, overtime, people taking leave. It captures the actual volume of work being done much better than just head counts. And interestingly, they even report on quality-adjusted hours worked.
Quality adjusted. What does that mean?
It tries to recognize that an hour worked by, say, a highly experienced engineer with a PhD might contribute more value than an hour worked by someone just starting out with less training. So they adjust the hours based on things like education and experience levels in the workforce.
That makes a lot of sense. It's not just about putting in the time, but the quality of that time, the skill behind it.
Exactly.
What about capital input? That sounds a bit more abstract than counting hours worked.
It is a bit more abstract, yeah.
Okay.
Capital input is essentially a measure of the services we get from our capital assets over a period. Think of it like this. A delivery van is a piece of capital stock, right? It's an asset. But the capital service is the actual transportation it provides day after day, which helps the business generate output.
Okay, the flow of services from the stock of assets.
Precisely. And these assets can be physical things like buildings, machines, vehicles, but also intangible things, which are increasingly important. Think software, databases, patents, R&D. And crucially, the ABS accounts for the fact that these assets wear out or become outdated over time. That's depreciation. They factor that in. Then, when they calculate MFP, they combine these measures of labor input, hours worked, maybe quality adjusted, and capital input, the flow of capital services, weighting each one based on how much it costs businesses.
Wow, so it's a really intricate process trying to capture all these different facets accurately.
Absolutely.
It's probably no surprise then, as our source indicates, that measuring productivity accurately comes with its fair share of, well, headaches.
Oh, definitely. There are several significant challenges. One major one is trying to measure the output of what we call non-market industries. Think about things like public administration, defense, compulsory education, a lot of healthcare.
Right, where there isn't a clear price tag on the service.
Exactly. In these sectors, there aren't always clear market prices reflecting supply and demand. So it's really difficult to put a definitive number on their output, let alone changes in quality. Because of this, the ABS actually only calculates MFP for the 16 designated market sector industries.
So huge chunks of the economy, like government services, education, health, they don't get an official MFP measure.
Not in the same way. They measure inputs and sometimes try to estimate output based on those inputs or other indicators, but calculating true productivity growth is much harder. And this lack of precise measurement, it makes it harder to track efficiency gains in really crucial sectors like health and education.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, how do you put a simple dollar value on the output of a public school education compared to, say, the number of cars rolling off an assembly line?
It's a fundamental challenge.
What other measurement hurdles are there?
Another issue is that productivity numbers can look quite different depending on the time frame you're looking at. They can be quite volatile in the short run. Think about a recession. Output might drop really quickly, but businesses can't always lay off staff or sell equipment instantly.
Right. Inputs are sticky.
Exactly. So inputs might fall slower than output, making productivity look like it's falling sharply. Then, during a recovery, output might bounce back faster than firms rehire, making productivity seem to surge. This cyclical volatility is why economists usually prefer to focus on longer-term trends, smoothing out those bumps to see the underlying growth rate.
So we really need to look at the long game to understand what's truly happening with productivity. Don't get too caught up in the quarterly numbers.
That's generally the advice, yes.
And the source also points out that some inputs and outputs are just inherently difficult to, well, get a handle on.
Absolutely. Things like the use of certain natural resources, how do you perfectly measure the depletion of water tables, for example, or the value of intangible assets. Think about a company's strong brand reputation, its unique organizational culture, or its network effects. These things are clearly valuable and contribute to output, but they're really tricky to measure and often aren't fully captured in the official capital statistics.
Yeah, and in today's economy where things like brand value and data and network effects seem so crucial, doesn't that significant gap in measurement potentially give us a kind of skewed picture of true productivity?
It's a very valid concern. It could mean we're understating MFP growth if these unmeasured intangibles are becoming more important drivers of output. It's an active area of research trying to improve these measurements.
So these measurement complexities really highlight that getting a truly precise measure of productivity is a tough nut to crack.
It certainly is.
But even with these challenges, understanding what fuels productivity growth is still absolutely vital. Our source brings up the production possibility frontier, the PPF. How does that model help us visualize this?
The PPF is a really helpful classic model in economics. Imagine you have a certain amount of resources, workers, machines, ingredients. The PPF shows all the different combinations of, say, two goods, like pizzas and cars, that an economy or a business could produce if it used all those resources as efficiently as possible with its current technology. It basically maps out the maximum potential output.
Okay, the edge of what's possible.
Exactly. And it helps us see the two main ways to boost productivity. One is becoming more efficient with what we have, and the other is expanding our overall capacity to produce more.
So if a business is operating inside that frontier, it's like they're leaving resources idle or not using them very well, like having pizza ingredients, but not making as many pizzas as they could.
Precisely. If you're inside the PPF, it means you could be producing more of at least one thing without having to cut back on anything else. You're being inefficient. Moving from a point inside the PPF out to a point right on the frontier represents a boost in productivity through better efficiency,
Yeah.
getting your act together, basically.
Right.
And our source notes that microeconomic reforms in Australia over the years, things like increasing competition, opening up trade, tax system changes, regulatory reforms, have often aimed to push businesses towards that frontier by encouraging them to operate more efficiently.
Okay, so that's about doing things smarter, using the resources we've already got more effectively. What about expanding that frontier itself? That sounds like getting a bigger pizza oven or maybe discovering a whole new, faster way to make pizzas.
Exactly that. Expanding productive capacity is shown by the entire PPF shifting outwards. This means we can now produce more of everything than was possible before, even when operating efficiently. And the source credits this expansion primarily to innovation and technological progress.
Oh, the magic ingredient.
Pretty much. These advances might come embodied in better physical capital, faster computers, more efficient robots, new materials. But they can also be about improvements in our knowledge, our human capital, or new ways of organizing things, process innovations that allow us to produce more even without necessarily investing in lots of new physical stuff.
So big inventions like, I don't know, the assembly line or maybe the development of new software that streamlines logistics, those kinds of things would push the whole frontier outwards.
Absolutely. Those are classic examples of technological advances driving productivity growth and expanding possibilities.
And the source also mentioned something called productivity spillovers. That sounds intriguing, like a nice bonus effect.
It is a nice bonus effect.
Spill the beans. What are those?
Productivity spillovers are essentially the positive knock-on effects that happen when one business's productivity improvements somehow help other businesses become more productive too, often without the original business intending it or being paid for it.
How does that work?
Well, knowledge is often the key. If a new technique or technology developed by one innovative company spreads to others, maybe through industry conferences, publications, supply chain relationships, or even just employees moving between firms and taking their knowledge with them, it can lift productivity across a wider sector or even the whole economy.
Wow, so it's like a ripple effect of good ideas. One company figures something out and others benefit too. That's fascinating.
It really is. It highlights how interconnected the economy is and why fostering innovation can have benefits far beyond just the innovating firm itself.
That makes perfect sense. A rising tide lifts all boats, maybe.
Something like that, yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about what productivity is, how we try to measure it despite the challenges, and what makes it grow efficiency, expanding capacity, those spillovers. But let's get to the crunch. Why should you, as a listener, really care about all this economic stuff? What are the tangible benefits for your daily life?
The why should I care question. And it's a crucial one. Productivity growth is absolutely fundamental to our economic well-being, to our living standards. Our source highlights 4 key ways it benefits us directly. First off, it can lead to higher wages.
Okay, now you have my attention. How?
Well, think about it. When workers become more productive, producing more output per hour, the labor cost for companies to produce each unit of output actually goes down, even if wages stay the same initially. This creates room for businesses to afford paying their workers more without necessarily eating into their profits. Higher productivity supports higher real wages over time.
Higher wage is definitely a big plus. What's the next benefit?
Secondly, productivity growth can lead to lower prices for consumers. If businesses are producing goods and services more efficiently, their costs are lower. They can then choose to pass those cost savings on to us, the consumers, through lower prices. This makes things more affordable, increases our purchasing power, and also makes Australian businesses more competitive against imports or in export markets.
Lower prices and potentially higher wages. That sounds like a pretty great combination. What's the third perk?
The third benefit mentioned is the potential for increased profits for businesses. When productivity goes up and it costs less to produce the same amount, businesses naturally tend to see their profit margins improve, assuming prices don't fall by the exact same amount. And these higher profits can then be reinvested back into the business, maybe in R&D or new equipment, fueling more productivity growth, or they can be distributed to the business owners and shareholders.
Okay, wages, prices, profits, and finally, the really big one that kind of underpins everything, stronger economic growth overall.
Exactly. This is perhaps the most fundamental point. The source emphasizes that simply adding more labor, like population growth, or more capital, more machines, to the production process eventually runs into what economists call diminishing returns. You get less and less extra output for each additional unit of input you throw in. Productivity growth, doing more with the same, or the same with less, driven by innovation and efficiency, becomes the primary sustainable driver of long-term improvements in our average living standards and overall economic prosperity. It's the engine of sustained economic growth in the long run.
So without productivity growth, just adding more people or building more factories won't keep making us significantly better off year after year indefinitely.
That's the standard economic argument, yes. Sustained increases in living standards ultimately rely on getting more productive. So even though it's complex to track perfectly, this is the data, this is the concept, that ultimately tells us if our living standards are likely to keep improving in the future.
Right. So higher productivity isn't just some abstract economic jargon politicians talk about it. It has a potentially direct impact on your paycheck, the prices you pay at the supermarket, the success of businesses in your community, and ultimately the overall health and future prosperity of our economy.
Precisely. It all ties together. Productivity growth feeds into economic growth, which supports higher incomes, allows for lower prices or higher profits, creating a kind of positive cycle that benefits pretty much everyone in the long run.
Well, we've certainly taken a deep dive into the world of productivity today. We've explored what labor and multi-factor productivity actually mean, the tricky business of measuring them accurately,
The headache.
the forces that drive their growth, getting more efficient, expanding our productive capabilities as beneficial spillovers, and most importantly, why it's just so crucial for our economic well-being through potentially higher wages, lower prices, stronger profits, and that sustainable long-run economic growth.
Yes, we've covered a lot of ground from the basic definition right through to the measurement challenges and its far-reaching benefits for everyone.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, here's maybe something for you, the listener, to ponder. Considering everything we've discussed today about what really drives those long-term improvements in our living standards, what specific innovations or perhaps government policies do you think will be the most vital for boosting Australia's productivity in the years ahead? Building on the concepts we've explored today, it's definitely something to chew on.